Hurricane Sandy wrecked a path of destruction along the eastern seaboard last week. It claimed the lives of 110, including Jacob Vogelman and Jesse Streichkest, both aged 23, who were walking in the street in Brooklyn and struck dead by a tree, including Connor and Brandon Moore, two brothers aged 4 and 2, who floodwaters came and swept them out of the arms of their mother. Our hearts go out to all the victims of Hurricane Sandy. And there are other victims of a different magnitude, those who have sustained enormous financial losses because their houses were flooded and they didn't have flood insurance, or their houses burnt down to the ground. There were those who unfortunately were displaced, the hundreds of thousands who didn't have electricity and haven't had electricity for days or even weeks. Our hearts go out to all of the victims. Now, what's interesting is that in the Jewish lexicon, there's a word for situations like this. Very often we say that this is a Nisayon. It's a test. The very derivation of the word begins in the Torah when God tells Avraham Avinu, tells Abraham, to offer his only son Yitzchak as a sacrifice. And there we're told that God Nisa Avraham, God tested Abraham. What is the meaning of a test? How do we understand it? Well, the first thing that you have to know about tests is that they're not simple. They are difficult. They are painful. In fact, when the Rashbam wants to define what the word Nisa means, he immediately says it doesn't mean test, it means pain. Because there's enormous pain and suffering when someone is tested. It's easy for those of us on the outside to think that we can go and preach to those who are tested. But the honest truth is that our preaching very often adds to their pain. We think that we can just talk to them like a football coach and say, oh, you know, in Chinese, the same word exists for crisis and opportunity. What we're actually doing is very often acting in an insensitive fashion. It's important for us to recognize that those who would sustain devastating losses are feeling pain. I remember one of the first funerals I attended when I was here in Montreal was a graveside funeral in which only 2 people came. The 2 people were the children of the woman who had passed away, the children of the deceased cousin. And they explained to me that the woman who had passed away was a survivor of the Holocaust. But since the Shoah, since the Holocaust, she could not put her life together. She couldn't find a job. She couldn't make friendships. The trauma of the Holocaust had truly destroyed her. And I think about this woman every time I think about people who are being tested, because we always like to think about those who pass the test. But it's important for us to recognize that there are many that cannot pass the test. And we need to be sensitive to those who are being tested, because the pain that they feel can sometimes be overwhelming. But tests teach us a lot. And very often, those of us who are hundreds of miles away can actually get inspiration from those who pass the test. In fact, one of the explanations of why God tests, why does God test anyone? What's the point of it? So Maimonides, the Rambam, in his guide for the perplexed, explains that tests are intended to inspire others. I, as someone who lives in Montreal and looks at the stories in New York, I am the sort of person who feels inspired by the heroes of Hurricane Sandy. And Maimonides is absolutely correct. When you see someone who passes a test, you yourself can be transformed by it. I think of the story of the nurses in NYU who had to come and evacuate hundreds of people. And in fact, there was a whole group of nurses that worked in the neonatal unit that had to manually work the respirators that were keeping these babies alive, because there was no longer any electricity to keep the respirators going. You have to think about all of these heroes, and you need to be inspired by them. And of course, among the great heroes of Hurricane Sandy are all of the first responders. The firemen, the policemen, the ambulance drivers, the paramedics. These are the people who help everyone else and put their own lives on the line. You know, it's interesting, in the United States, we really don't know what a hero is. We think a hero is a sports star or a Hollywood celebrity. In actuality, the real heroes are the heroes that come to save lives. They're the people who stand on the front lines. They're the policemen and the firemen, the nurses and the soldiers. And in Hurricane Sandy, we saw what a real hero looks like, and we were able to be inspired by them. But there's another lesson of Nisayon, of tests. You know, it's a lesson that the Ramban perhaps articulates to some extent, and then Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, on a little bit of a different light or a different interpretation, continues that explanation. Rav Hirsch and the Ramban more or less are saying that a test transforms the person who is being tested. Very often what happens is that after the test, even if it's traumatic, the person finds themselves stronger and having greater character. Rav Hirsch says that the word nisa in Hebrew is very similar to another Hebrew word, which is nasa. That nisa, being tested, is similar to being nasa, raised up. Very often, when you can pass the test, you become a different person. And not only is your character different, but very often you're a lot wiser. You know, Rashi, in his commentary to the Torah right after the test of Abraham. So Abraham is tested, he's asked to bring his only son Isaac as a sacrifice, and then after the entire test goes on and God tells Abraham you don't have to sacrifice Isaac, so then Rashi tells us that Abraham is thinking to himself, why didn't I make a shidduch for my son Isaac? Why didn't I make a match for him? I needed to make sure that he got married. Why was I waiting so long? It's nearly 37 years. And this is a beautiful comment because it shows us the wisdom that sometimes people learn when they're tested. It shows us how you get a different perspective after a test. And I want to just quote a letter written by Rabbi Heshi Billet of the Young Israel of Woodmere. And his synagogue and his area has been rather hard hit by the storm. And he wrote a letter to his congregation just in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And I want to just quote from the end of it. He says, in our family, we have a slogan about material losses. It is only money. We learned the hard and painful way that there are things far more precious than possessions. Material items are a transient gift of the Ribono Shel Olam. We cherish our family, our community, our friends, and the privilege to be part of Am Yisrael. So keep a positive spirit. This too shall pass. We will see you in shul as soon as we get a rowboat. This beautiful note really shows you the wisdom of being tested. The things that are important are the fact that you've got a family, and you've got friends, and you've got a community. It is difficult to be tested, but sometimes in the aftermath of the test, you can be inspired and you can become wiser. I pray for all of those who are enduring suffering because of this hurricane. But I want those who are acting as heroes, those who are teaching the rest of us, that we are inspired by what you do.